Welcome to Writer's Block. I'm your host, Journal staff writer Sean Reider. If you enjoy our podcast, please like and subscribe and consider becoming a digital subscriber to the Albuquerque Journal to help us continue to bring more content like this. You can find this episode and all of our podcasts on the Albuquerque Journal website at abqjournal.com, as well as on YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, and SoundCloud. See the show notes for a discount on a digital subscription if you're interested. And thank you for supporting the Albuquerque Journal, New Mexico's leading local news source. All right, welcome back to another episode of Writer's Block. I am your host, Journal staff writer Sean Reider, and today, been a minute, but we're going to be kind of breaking down a really hectic, really interesting kind of month for New Mexico football, and kind of talking about the hiring of new head football coach Jason Eck, some of the news around his first coaching staff in New Mexico, and also some player news in regards to the portal and kind of who's coming in, who's going out, and what we might need to kind of look for going there. As I mentioned, it's been a minute. The last time I did this, Bronco Mendenhall was the head coach at New Mexico, and in early December, that was no longer true. He left to take the head coaching job at Utah State. I'm sure if you're listening to this, you already kind of know about what happened there, but to kind of give a brief summary of all that, Bronco initially denied and also didn't quite deny that he had heard from Utah State, that he had talked to Utah State about their head coaching position and all that too, and only a couple days later, he was on the move. He said that move was motivated really more than anything by family. Bronco's mother, 93 years old, I believe. She lives in Utah. He wanted to be closer to her in particular. And all three of his sons, Cutter, Breaker, and Raider, they all live in Utah as well, too. I believe they live in Provo, and are either going to school at BYU or something like that. And he was adamant in his introductory press conference at Utah State when he was asked about it, that everything there was about family. And now we are kind of in a spot where Jason Eck is the new head coach. It's the third head coach in as many years for New Mexico. I kind of want to share a couple of my thoughts on the hire. I've written a little about some of my thoughts here, and kind of been on live shows with my colleague Jeff Grammer and talked about it there too, but haven't really done it in this format. I guess to kind of start, I wasn't privy to where this coaching search really started. And that's kind of a tough deal sometimes. It was a new athletic director, Fernando Lovo. This was his first hire. You were kind of curious to see which direction it was going to go, considering the connections he had in college football. I wasn't quite privy to the start. I'd like to think I was relatively privy to how it ended. And from the names I kind of ended up hearing, Jason Eck ended up being the best hire, at least in my opinion right now. He was the head coach at Idaho for 3 seasons, was 26-13 there overall, 3 FCS playoff appearances, and Idaho's a tough place to win. Whether it was FCS or FBS, not a lot of long, sustained periods of success there. And he was a guy that came in and really flipped the energy and kind of made them into a consistent winner. And that's just not something, again, that they've been historically. And if you do well at Idaho, Dennis Erickson is a name that kind of comes to mind. You're going to be on the move. And it seemed like Eck was always going to be destined to be a kind of FBS coach and get looks kind of at the G5 level or something of that nature too. I don't know if I would call this the safe hire or a truly safe hire. You're always going to see, you always need to see how things are going to play out. But I think he had a little bit of an edge in the sense that he was a sitting head coach, had done things, had wanted a place where it had been difficult to win at, much like New Mexico historically. And he had a lot of assistant experience at places that have done really well. South Dakota State, he was the O-line coach there and the offensive coordinator for quite a good period there. Worked under a really good coach, a Hall of Fame coach, and John Stiegelmeier, a guy that built that South Dakota State program all the way up to, really an FCS national title. And I think that those experiences kind of are what ended up setting him apart from other candidates that we kind of learned about. Fernando Lovo never gave out the kind of parameters or the criteria he was looking for in this next head coach, but I think those factors in particular, and also his reputation. I've talked to some people kind of throughout the industry, and I'm not saying I have all these industry connections, but you just haven't heard a bad thing yet about Eck, and the job that he's done certainly entitled him to get another job quite like this one. Early on, though, I think winning the press conference ends up with kind of like a negative connotation in some ways, and that's probably, if anything, that's us to blame. We use that term a lot. I do think it is possible to win the press conference and actually win a bunch of games later on. And I think Eck did win the press conference. There's always that cliche of, some coaches are guys you'd like to get a beer with and all that too. And I think he struck that tone really well during his introductory press conference. And he also kind of struck the tone of, hey, these are my goals, though. We do want to win games. We do want to get fans back. But we understand, too, that the only way to really get fans back, the only surefire way, is to go out and to win games and all that, too. In terms of his goals that he kind of talked about in his introductory press conference and in a one-on-one I had with him after, I think it is safe to say that they really want to compete for a bowl this year. The anecdote he kind of shared with me was that when he stepped into the job at Idaho, he knew that they needed to be better than they were in that first year. They needed to be better than they were the year before. And I believe that in 2021, the year before he came in, they were 4-7. 2022, his first year at Idaho, they ended up finishing 7-5, FCS playoff appearance, which is pretty good stuff. That's a nice year-to-year turnaround. And they played, I believe, Washington State and Indiana, two FBS opponents. Didn't beat them, but played them pretty well there. He made it clear that, this is kind of a similar situation. They have to find a way to be better than they were last year. And in terms of the record, 5-7 to 6-6, a better record, that would mean a bowl. And unless something really crazy happened where there was too many bowl-eligible teams, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there if that does indeed happen. It's definitely, I wouldn't say it's extremely lofty expectations there. This is a roster relatively in flux, but it's a guy that seems pretty comfortable in terms of building a roster and making it work, and a staff that seems pretty comfortable at that too. A lot of guys on the same page, and we'll get to that in a little bit too. I think UNM in some ways did benefit from a relatively top-heavy Mountain West last year, where they ended up winning, more league games than they had since, I believe, 2016. And it was kind of a deal where it was, Boise State, UNLV, and then Colorado State kind of got hot too, but they weren't really infallible either. Those teams kind of were at the front, and then there was a bunch of other teams that were all kind of at the same level, even if the records didn't always reflect that. Anybody could lose on any given night, and we'll see if the league does end up kind of looking like that to a certain capacity. I think that'll influence that more than anything else, but we're going to learn about this roster, and we're going to talk a little bit about it more, and that'll certainly play a big role. One thing I did find interesting in talking to him was, for a long time, it's been pretty tough to get an FBS job straight from the FCS level, to the point where Jeff Choate is the name that comes to mind. He's the head coach in Nevada. Jeff Choate was the head coach at Montana State, did a really great job there, rebuilt a historic FCS program, or Division I AA, however you want to call it. Built that program right back up, but he's been pretty candid about this in the past. Wasn't getting a lot of interest from FBS schools or G5 schools for head coaching opportunities. And what he ended up doing was going and being the co-defensive coordinator at Texas under head coach Steve Sarkisian. And in doing that for a couple years, that eventually kind of opened the door for an opportunity like a Nevada and all that too. And probably will help him in some other opportunities down the road as well too. Matt Entz is another name that comes to mind. He was the head coach in North Dakota State, which just won, not with Matt Entz, but with Tim Polsek as the head coach. Their 10th FCS title in the last 15 years, something like that. Unreal kind of a run for really the powerhouse in the FCS and all that. And Entz was a guy that he took basically a position coaching job after the end of, not last season, but 2 seasons ago at USC to be a linebackers coach. He took on another weird title like the head coach of the defense. Well, now he's the head coach at Fresno State. I asked Eck, was that anything that ever actually interested you? I mean, because you had done such a good job at Idaho, but you would imagine that, it would be kind of tough to make that jump from Idaho to an FBS program. And he flat out said it was something that really never interested him, to the point when Phil Longo, who was the offensive coordinator at Wisconsin, when he got fired this season, Eck has a lot of family in Wisconsin. He played football at Wisconsin. He was an offensive lineman there for Barry Alvarez. When that all kind of happened, you had family members reaching out and asking, hey, why don't you go at this job? why don't you take a look? And he said, really wasn't interested because, one, the sense of, you dance with who you brought and all that as well. When you do something like that, he said, you kind of leave your staff in the lurch. And also he just, from a preference sense, he likes being a head coach and he thinks he's pretty good at it. And he thinks he's shown that he can be pretty good at it. And it really wasn't going to probably be a coordinator position that was going to get him out of Idaho. And I think that's a pretty interesting angle. I do think it's becoming easier, and this hiring is kind of a sign to go from FCS to FBS in that regard as a head coach and all that. But the fact that he did it on his own terms and from a place like Idaho, I do think that's interesting. We'll talk about a lot of players in a bit too. I do kind of want to, and this is something I talked about on live shows of Jeff Grammer. You don't make this hire because he can bring in a bunch of good players from Idaho. Just kind of that one-time thing. You don't make this hire just to make that first year easier or smoother. I think in the end, if you do end up having a bad year one or whatever with whatever candidate you got, but he ends up being the right guy and rebuilding it and bringing New Mexico football all the way back up, then you look at it as a success. But in terms of having a guy that can do that, he can bring over and has brought over some pretty good players from Idaho. I think that is something that really helps, and I think that is something that people should be relatively excited for. You do have a guy that can bring in a good core of players in a way that, frankly, it ended up working out pretty well with Bronco Mendenhall, but it was a good question. He was a guy that had been out of the game, and he was bringing guys in that, had been a part of different staffs and had seen different players and all that as well too, but it was a question I kind of had with him, and it's not really a question with Eck, and we'll get more to those players, but again, I don't think you make that hire, and I don't think they did, just to bring those guys in. But at the same time, it can only help. In terms of the coaching staff, it's not totally finalized, but you won't be shocked. There's a lot of Idaho ties. The big one that kind of comes to mind with me, and he's a guy that we're looking to sit down with real soon, maybe in the studio, Luke Schleissner, the offensive coordinator. He was ex-offensive coordinator at Idaho. All 3 years there, and then he had worked with Eck at South Dakota State. He was also the tight ends coach at South Dakota State. He developed a guy by the name of Dallas Goedert into an NFL product there from a walk-on from, I don't even remember his hometown in South Dakota. If you've watched a good amount of NFL games with Goddard in them, then you've definitely kind of seen the points where they mention where he's from in South Dakota, but a very small town to an NFL player. That's a pretty nice piece to have on your resume there. But Schleissner is not particularly surprising that he is the offensive coordinator there. He got brought over as the offensive coordinator, I should say. I think the one thing, and we're going to learn more about those offenses, the offense that they ran and probably would intend to run here, is that at Idaho, they were really there was an emphasis on, we're not going to install a lot of stuff the week of because we think it's going to give us this matchup here, or I think a term that I've heard them use is how expensive is it to install stuff that is kind of outside of the base offense. And I think you're going to see a really sound offense out of these guys, or at least the makings of that. Some of the schematic things, there's a good emphasis on mid-zone and Y-cross concepts in particular. They ran those to a lot of success at Idaho. Again, we're going to learn a lot more about it, but Schleissner is a guy that has been a long time D2 FCS assistant. He's done a lot of nice work in different spots. So I think, I don't know if it's quite the excitement of pulling in a kind of veteran or well-named FBS play caller, but I do think there is something to be excited about there. In terms of the assistants, position coaches, I should say, O-line coach Cody Booth, that's an Idaho guy. Defensive line coach Hebron Fangupo, Idaho guy. DB's coach Stanley Franks Jr., also coming over from Idaho, so there's a lot of continuity there. One thing that he talked about in a one-on-one I kind of had with him, X said he felt he had a good FCS staff, but he recognized that, look, we are going to another level, and we're going to bring some guys over for sure, but you kind of need guys with familiarity with the regions you want to recruit. He cited California, Arizona. I think I have reason to believe that Texas is going to be an area that they're going to end up targeting. And I think some of the hires that were announced this week kind of fit that billing there. Running backs coach John Johnson, who's coming over from Sam Houston State. Special teams coordinator Daniel DePrado, who's coming over from Texas State. They've all worked with Eck in the past. I believe John Johnson worked with him at South Dakota State, and DePrado worked with him when Eck was the O-line coach at Montana State. I think those guys might just fit that billing of guys who've been FBS assistants and guys that have also worked with Eck and could maybe open some things up for them in terms of recruiting in different areas that are maybe closer to New Mexico than Idaho and the like too. One interesting thing, though, on New Year's Eve, the news was announced by South Dakota State. Dan Jackson, who was announced as the defensive coordinator only a handful of days prior at New Mexico, was announced as the head coach at South Dakota State. Dan Jackson, a former linebacker at South Dakota State, a guy that worked his way up from really, I believe it was just like a defensive analyst role in kind of the early 2000s all the way up to assistant head coach. Their lead secondaries coach, their lead defensive backs coach there, that guy, ended up kind of going back home for him. So we're going to stay tuned on what might happen there. In terms of the defense, they ran more of a 4-2-5 at Idaho. X said that will probably be the element they bring. At the time, that was when Dan Jackson was slated to come here. I don't know how much Jackson not coming here changes that, if at all. It might just be a preference thing where regardless, that's kind of what fits Idaho's offense to a certain degree and complements it. And that's something that X said in his introductory press conference. He wants to play complementary football. You don't want to just throw it a million times just to get a bunch of stats. You want to win games. And it might also be contingent on the players they have. I mean, if you're deep at linebacker and you're kind of thin at defensive line, then you're probably not going to force a 4-2-5. But I think that's all something to monitor. Who they end up making the hire at with defensive coordinator should be relatively interesting, and I'm expecting that news to come relatively soon. Now, I know the transfer portal. We see the numbers in terms of what content does well at the Journal, and I know the transfer portal is obviously a huge piece of interest for a lot of readers and a lot of people that follow the program. I don't know how much we need to go over, but to kind of refresh, on the early going after Bronco Mendenhall left, and really even just right before he left, wasn't the kind of start to the portal season for UNM. You obviously lost star quarterback Devin Dampier to Utah following former UNM offensive coordinator Jason Beck there. Running back Eli Sanders to USC, wide receiver Luke Weissong to Arizona, and a ton of other good players, good pieces. I mean, running back Javen Jacobs to Utah State, Mackenzie Agnello, the center, who I thought was phenomenal this last year for UNM, to Houston, Jaden Wilson to UTEP. All went into the portal, all committed to other schools. Right now, by my count, 17 players have committed to other schools out of the portal for UNM. I believe the number right now for players still in the portal is, I want to say, about 15. But I also haven't seen the actual, here's who's in the transfer portal, access to the portal in a little bit. At the end of it all, UNM also lost nearly the entirety of its offensive line, but there were a few, however, that did end up coming out of the portal. I do think there will be a couple more that do end up coming out of the portal too, but we'll have to wait and see what happens there. Of the major three that did end up coming out of the portal that we know of, safety Tavian Combs, he announced he was entering the portal in November. That was a guy who, if you follow New Mexico football, you're well familiar with Combs. When he's healthy, he's one of the best players in the field, but unfortunately was not healthy this last year, was kind of battling nagging leg and ankle injuries throughout the year that he suffered in 2023. Ended up getting healthy enough to be cleared to practice and played 5 snaps, I want to say, against Wyoming in early November. 2 weeks later, announced that he was going to enter the portal. A little bit of a shock from what I knew within the program there. And he entered the portal and ended up committing to the University of Louisiana Monroe. That's where former UNM offensive coordinator Brian Vincent is the head coach. Former UNM DC Troy Reffett is also coaching with Vincent down there too. Combs committed to them, and only a couple days later kind of tweeted some cryptic stuff about how he probably was not actually committed to them, and that his recruitment was reopened. He's a guy that Eck was able to get back, and I do think that's a pretty big win for them. The fact that they were able to get a guy who has a lot of experience, will be going on his 6th year of college football, I believe, and has when he's healthy, has a pretty high ceiling that he can access and pretty good leadership, brings that to the position group. I'm expecting to be a contributor in the secondary, and I think that's a nice win for them. Right guard Richard Pierce is another guy that they also got to come back. I think this might be the biggest one, if we're being honest. The past 2 seasons, UNM has basically had to rebuild their entire starting offensive lines. It's really been kind of fascinating to see out. The fact that they were as good as they were under Bronco Mendenhall on the offensive line, I thought was really kind of the ultimate feather in that coaching staff's hat, putting together a bunch of transfers that had never played together and making it a kind of, not just palatable, but legitimately good product in the Mountain West. And it really looked like they were on pace to do that heading into the Jason Eck era. Pierce coming back ensures that they won't quite have to do that. They're still going to have to fill all 4 other spots. But that's a really good piece to add, and it's a really good piece to have back. Pierce is a guy that was a team captain last year, a guy that was involved in the community notably. He organized and held a Thanksgiving turkey drive, right outside the pit and University Stadium as well, too. So I think that's a nice get for them. And also backup center Malik Alaim, a NIMI transfer who came in prior to last season as well. Ended up doing some special package stuff, for UNM. Also played a little bit of backup nose guard towards the end of last season. Didn't get extensive reps there too, but I would have to imagine as of right now that he would be coming back as an offensive lineman, and I think that's a good get there too. Now, UNM has added 16 players out of the portal in terms of players they've announced and players they've received commitments from. To kind of break that down, 4 are from the FBS ranks. We'll talk a little bit about the FCS-FBS dynamic in the portal that I kind of believe. Keegan Johnson, to me, is the big name here. He was Kansas State's second leading receiver last season. I believe 29 catches for 359 yards and 1 touchdown. Good body, 6 foot tall, 206 pounds. He's a former 4-star prospect out of Omaha. And frankly, that is a major position of need. UNM lost Luke Wysong, who was excellent last year. They lost Ryan Davis, who's headed to Utah. They desperately, to keep going on that, Caleb Medford is still in the transfer portal. I have not seen him commit anywhere quite yet. Nick Trujillo ended up transferring to the University of Louisiana Monroe. So you need quality wide receivers in this room. This is a staff that in the past has shown that they can develop good receivers. Jordan Dwyer, who was really good for Idaho this last season, just transferred to TCU. So I think, there's more work to be done with that room in terms of adding good pieces and making sure that they're the right guys. But Keegan Johnson seems like a pretty good fit so far, so curious to see what kind of happens there. A few big names here out of Idaho. Quarterback Jack Lane, he was the starter entering last season. He got sidelined with an injury, I believe a collarbone injury, I want to say. Ended up finishing the year strong with 14 touchdowns and 4 interceptions. UNM hasn't had a real kind of quarterback battle, controversy in fall camp or anything like that over the past 2 years. In 2023, Dylan Hopkins was more or less always going to be the starter. It wasn't always outright said, but if you were around the program, you kind of knew. In 2024, Bronco Mendenhall came out and first week of spring practice said that Devin Dampier was going to be the guy. I don't know if Lane is going to get the starting tag at the beginning of spring practice or fall camp, or if, frankly, we're still pretty early into this. I don't know who else they might add, but I don't know if that'll all happen. But at the same time, you kind of needed a clear-cut quarterback to kind of anchor things early on, and I think Lane absolutely provides that, and I think he has the ability to be a good starter in this league. Other big name, Eck's son, Jackson Eck, all Big Sky linebacker. Right now, that's a position of relative need for UNM, and he was awfully productive last year in a defense that, honestly, if you go back and watch a lot of those games, was pretty darn good. I did ask Jason on his after his introductory press conference if he was recruiting his son, and he said, all I can say is that we are recruiting him, but and I think that's about as far as it'll go. But I think that's a pretty good get for them. All things aside, and again, you lost some pretty good linebacker talent, whether to eligibility kind of running out like Demetri Johnson, or the transfer portal Jaden Wilson. And I think Eck is a guy that can definitely has shown that he has the ability to lead that room. And then defensive lineman Keyshawn James Newby, another Idaho guy. This guy was, frankly, outstanding for Idaho last year. The numbers right now, 14.5 tackles, for loss, 10.5 sacks, 65 total tackles, which I think was 4th on the team. This guy was, big time disruptive for that Idaho defense. I've written about it a lot. Idaho is when they were at Idaho, I know that they didn't want to blitz a ton. That really wasn't quite their philosophy and all that too. I don't anticipate them blitzing as much as former defensive coordinator Nick Howell, who's here with Bronco Mendenhall and all that too. But to have a guy that was that disruptive, that really only helps things. And this is a program that has just frankly not had a very good pass rush or very reliable pass rush the last 2 years. Adding a guy like that is kind of a huge thing. One thing that X said in the kind of one-on-one that I had with him that I thought was pretty interesting is that, when he was kind of coming up in the FCS ranks and when he was a head coach in the FCS ranks, he said you got to see a lot of players that, weren't quite heralded names that ended up being really good players. And you kind of have that knowledge of, hey, these are some good players here that aren't quite tucked away or stashed away or whatever. But, these are programs that develop guys too and done a nice job at the FCS level. With that in mind, I don't think it's an indictment or a bad approach at all to actually stock and rebuild this roster with a good deal of FCS players. If anything, I think it's a really good idea. There's a ton of talent in the FCS ranks. He mentioned that there's some people that do believe that the best player in the FCS isn't as good as the worst player in the FBS, and frankly, I agree with him, and I think that's a good way to build it through, frankly, long-term, and also this year-one deal where they're going to have to lean on the portal. He said that, they want this program to be built through high school recruiting, and they want to really hit all their areas hard, and they want it to be a developmental program. It's something that they've shown that they're pretty good at. But at the same time, this year one, you're going to have to do different things to kind of supplement the roster going through. With that all being said, those are kind of all the thoughts that I have on kind of the first month of the Jason Eck era. We're not even a month truly into it. And the last month for UNM football, easily one of the most chaotic things I've covered in my time in New Mexico. All that being said, thank you all for listening. Want to encourage you guys to subscribe to our Spotify, Apple, and YouTube page, and subscribe to the Journal as a whole. We're coming out with news every day about UNM football, UNM basketball, and we're really, really excited to keep doing so.